Yeah, hello everyone, Nevin Reacts here, and welcome back into another video. So today I'm going to be reacting to the first War by Extra History. Uh, I do know about the Opium War. I was taught about it in like uh, grade seven. But there's a difference between learning in class and learning in, uh, you know, uh, history videos and documentaries, because you might learn more, you know? So, yeah. I know it's about tea and opium, and I do quite enjoy a cup of tea myself. But anyway, let's get started, shall we? Like,
In 1792, Britain has just come out of a war that's cost it not only much of its national treasury, but also one of its most lucrative overseas colonies, North America. The empire needs new sources of revenue, new opportunities for trade, and there's one clear possibility: China.
I love extra credits as intro. It's really, catchy. Short but catchy.
By the end of the 18th century, the world had become a much smaller place, with European traders traveling the globe to feed the hungry markets of the industrializing West. Wars were fought all over the planet to secure exotic goods or the raw materials needed to power new economies of the rising European empires. But China still remained aloof. Demand for Chinese goods was high. Silk, porcelain, and especially tea were coveted by buyers.
Oh yeah, the British sure do love their tea, so do I. My favorite brand and type of tea was uh, Twinings Earl Grey, with a hint of milk and sugar. Oh, and by the way, put some tea drinking etiquette. If the tea is served or is already in the cup, you pour the milk in first. You pour the milk in, but if the tea is in a pot, like a teapot or an infuser, you put the milk in the cup first, then the tea. And you know how, like, what you grab a teaspoon and you, like, stir it in a circle? Turns out that's not the right way to stir your drinks. You stir it back and forth, which is the proper way and proper etiquette of drinking beverages like tea or coffee or whatever.
Back in Europe. But the Chinese emperors saw all these foreign traders as a potentially destabilizing influence, and as they had done throughout Chinese history, placed strict controls on foreign trade. Specifically, they limited trade to just a few ports. Traders weren't allowed to set foot in the empire except at a handful of cities designated for that purpose. And all trade had to go through a trade monopoly known as the Hong, who could tax and regulate foreign trade as they saw fit. By the middle of the 18th century, this was taken further, and all foreign trade was restricted to a single port, Canton. This drove resentment among the European traders who saw limitless opportunity for profit if they could just get their hands on it. And those Europeans trading in China were, in some ways, a self-selecting group. If you're gonna make your living transporting goods thousands of miles from your home, you probably believe in the inherent value of unrestricted trade, which meant that these rules did not sit well with the Europeans, and piracy and smuggling began to rise. Even within the official channels of trade, merchants began to strain at these limitations. Eventually, an employee of the Honorable East India Company, the militarized trade organization responsible for British affairs in India, pushed by what he saw.
You know what? Never mind. I'm going to take off the hat. Maybe I should consider buying a new one, because it's kinda getting itchy having to wear that.
As abuses of corrupt officials and undue restrictions on free trade, decided that it was time to openly break the rules that the Chinese imposed. He left Canton and took his grievances upriver, literally and figuratively, wanting to be heard by someone in the Chinese hierarchy who was outside the Hong, outside the monopoly set up in Canton. And here's where divides of culture come in. Because it's possible that he wasn't acting in a way that he saw as malicious or even inappropriate. In fact, he may have been acting in a way that he thought of as perfectly reasonable were he in England. But he wasn't in England, and
Yep, and that is why, like, for example, when you go to a foreign nation, you have to at least learn some of the basic rules there, such as what is illegal, what's not, what's considered rude, and what's not considered rude. You know?
And the arrogance of this traitor just deciding that his complaints should be elevated to imperial court rather than going through the proper authorities was unbelievable to the Chinese. More than that, it put into question whether these Europeans would stay in one port at all, or even obey Chinese law. And so further restrictions were put into place. Trade was clamped down on even more. But European demands for Chinese goods, especially English demands for their newfound love of black tea, continued to grow, which brings us back to 1792. By this point, the British were importing tens of millions of pounds of tea every year. Within 2 decades, import duties on tea would account for 10% of the government's entire revenue. Tea was one of the major drivers of the economy. Tea was so essential to the British world that the Canton system was simply no longer acceptable. And more than that, the British were now running an enormous trade deficit with the Chinese. Millions of pounds of silver were flowing out.
Imagine a country where at least 10% of its income and GDP all come from tea. That's only a feat that the British can achieve.
Out of the British Empire and into China. On top of that, recent European struggles had cut them off from the silver mines of South America, and costly foreign wars had left the treasury dry. Even the Honorable East India Company was broke, incurring a huge debt to finance their military conquests of parts of India. The British Empire, for all of its power and its wealth, for all its global might and territory in every region of the globe, simply did not have the raw currency it needed to continue paying for its tea habit. So, the British decided that it was time to finally send an official diplomatic mission to China. No more traders, merchants, or pirates. This was going to be a real envoy from one monarch to another to talk about opening up trade. After some consideration, it was decided that the first Earl of Macartney, a seasoned colonial governor, should lead the mission. His aims were simple: end the Canton system, establish a permanent embassy, or at least get a permanent British representative in the imperial court, and, if possible, secure the grant of a small island off the coast of China where British merchants could operate under British rather than Chinese law. So they packed the hold of a ship with clocks and telescopes and even carriages to be presented to the Chinese emperor and began their trip. They sailed east around the Cape of Good Hope, with only one minor detour when the trade winds pushed them all the way to Rio de Janeiro. At last, though, they arrived in...
Imagine from all the way here, then when you're just halfway there, you get sent, the winds send you to all the way to the Americas. I can't imagine how long that must have taken, considering how it just takes 9 months to get from Europe to Asia.
China. They immediately asked to dock at a port much closer to Beijing than Canton. This was considered bad form by the Chinese, but representatives of the East India Company explained that they had expensive gifts for the emperor on board, and didn't want any of them to get ruined in a long overland journey, so the Chinese acquiesced. They and their goods were ferried up the Grand Canal to Beijing, and here they assembled their gifts and prepared for the last leg of their journey, over the Great Wall and to the Emperor's summer palace at Jahal. Here they finally met the Emperor. And trouble began immediately. Because in the presence of the Emperor, it was expected that everyone kowtow, or kneel and bow so low that their head touched the floor. And Macartney, being a seasoned British governor and gentleman, hailing from what he believed was the most powerful and civilized nation in the world with, as he saw it, the most divine monarch, and not only the right but the duty to spread the British way around the globe, refused to do so. After all, if he wasn't going to touch his head to the floor for King George, he certainly wasn't going to do it here. So, after some wrangling and protestations, he proposed a counter-solution. He would perform the kowtow so long as, every time it was done, a Chinese official of equal rank would kowtow to a picture of George III. This was, of course, ludicrous to the Chinese, as, after all, they were from the most powerful and civilized nation in the world, with the most divine monarch, and who was this barbarian to try to put his king on anything like the Emperor's level? Seriously. But even without the kowtow issue truly resolved, with Macartney merely genuflecting in the end, as he would to King George, the meeting went forward. Macartney showed off the marvels of British science, although mostly the flashier and less practical kind, and presented them to the Emperor. And here too, signals got crossed, because the Chinese court took this as a tribute mission. After all gift-giving missions to the Emperor are tribute missions. What else would it be? And yet the British thought that they were demonstrating all the reasons that China would benefit from opening up trade with them. So in the end, Macartney was dismissed without the Emperor agreeing to a single one of the goals he set out to achieve. and the emperor sent one of the most gloriously, imperially snarky letters ever penned to King George, thanking him for his tribute which, though neither he nor the Chinese actually wanted it, he would graciously accept out of respect for how far George had sent people just to pay him tribute. But no, China didn't need baubles or knickknacks from England, thank you. Trade would...
Wow. How snarky is that from a scale of 1 to 10? Type down in the comments.
remained the way it was. So Britain was left with a massive trade deficit. The East India Company was £28 million in debt as a result of their war in India, and the royal coffers were nearly dry. They needed to find some product the Chinese wanted. And then they did. Opium.
Britain broke in China with its strict regulations. If you've been taught about the Opium War already in class, then you already know what's gonna happen. Anyway, let's get to it, to episode 2. Come on.
Last we left off, the treasury of the British Empire was flowing into China, and the Honorable East India Company was still reeling under the staggering debt it owed the government for underwriting its military conquests in India. Something needed to be done. They needed to find some tradable good, something other than silver, that the Chinese wanted to import to offset the massive costs of the Victorian need for tea. And the answer they found was opium. By the early 1800s, tea sales in England were unimaginably high. Given the quantity they were importing, the average English household spent about 5% of its income just on tea.
Imagine. Look at our society today where most people are hooked on drugs such as cocaine. Back then, and somewhat to this day, the British are addicted to tea to the point where they even go to war over it. This is somewhat hilarious.
The government itself was basically propped up by the tea trade. Because the government had lent the Honorable East India Company so much money to conquer parts of India, and because a huge portion of the East India Company's revenue came from transporting tea from China, the country was even more dependent on the tea trade, as that revenue was being used not only to repay the debt the company had incurred, but to pay interest on it. But even as the tea craze was consuming England, the Honorable East India Company was also coming to the realization that their conquests in India weren't realizing the returns they'd hoped. Their plans to grow cotton in India had gone awry as cotton production in the Americas, and especially in Egypt, were on the rise. But it turns out that something else grew really well on all that land that they'd planned to use for cotton. Poppies. So the East India Company found its solution. They would grow poppies in India, convert them into opium, sell that at a profit in China, use the profit to buy tea, and then sell that at a profit back in Britain. There were only a few...
Step 1, grow some flowers. Step 2, turn them into drugs. Step 3, sell the drugs. Step 4, use the profit from drugs to buy tea. Step 5, sell tea bought with drug profit for more profit. What could go wrong?
Problems with this plan. Besides the fact that it meant pushing drugs on an unheard of scale, there was also the issue that opium was technically illegal in China.
Britain being the Pablo Escobar or whatever that famous drug dealer's name was back then.
And the Honorable East India Company, being of course the Honorable East India Company, would never do something illegal. Okay, they would, but they didn't want to risk getting kicked out of China or cut off from its tea. So they set up a market in Calcutta, basically the part of India closest to China that they controlled. And they said, anybody who wants to buy opium, we're selling it right here. No idea what you might want to do with it, but hey, that's not our business. Who wants some opium? Come on. And then they would let the smugglers handle it from there. So now you've got a bunch of dodgy characters selling drugs in the Middle Kingdom, basically backed by the largest corporation and the largest national economy in the world. And, as Indian opium turned out to be even stronger than the domestically grown stuff, everybody wanted it. So opium sales skyrocketed, and by 1835 they were moving roughly 3,064,000 pounds of opium per year into China. And that number was only going to get bigger, because in 1833 the British government decided to finally do away with the Honorable East India Company's monopoly on the opium trade. Now everybody wanted a piece of the action, and opium started flowing into China completely unregulated, increasing supply, driving prices down, and making the substance even more accessible. By 1839, nearly 5,639,000 pounds of opium would be pouring into China every year. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because it's not like the Chinese were just sitting around letting this happen. As piles of money which the government desperately needed flowed out of the country, the emperor appointed an official named Lin Zexu to address the disastrous effects of opium on the country. He was brilliant, incorruptible, and utterly inflexible. He saw the threat of the West and the morally corrupting effect that opium had had on the Chinese people, and decided that the only approach to take was the complete removal of opium from China. By March of 1839, he had reached Canton. It was the source of all this opium, so he planned to cut it off at its source. His actions were swift and uncompromising. He arrested thousands of Chinese opium traders, forced addicts into rehabilitation programs, confiscated opium pipes, and closed opium dens. And then he took on the Western traders. At first, he wrote an open letter to Queen Victoria appealing to her conscience, a letter which it's very likely she never received. When he got no reply, he demanded that the foreigners surrender their stores of opium. The foreign merchants stalled and prevaricated, giving up small amounts of their opium stock but nowhere near what Lin Zexu had demanded. So he marshaled the troops and put the foreign warehouses to siege. The merchants holed up for a month and a half, but in the end they gave in, and were forced to surrender 21,000 chests of opium. For the next 23 days, Zexu burned the opium with lye. This was a king's ransom in opium. The amount of money this destruction represented is staggering. It was roughly 1/6 as much as the British Empire, the largest
That's how you start a war with Great Britain. You hit them you kick them where it hurts. The wallet.
most far-flung empire in the world had spent on its military the previous year. Needless to say, everybody involved was going bankrupt. Now, there is some debate over whether the Chinese offered tea in exchange for the surrendered opium, but what is certain is that the merchants never received any tea, and instead the local chief superintendent of British trade, one Captain Charles Elliot, promised the merchants that the British government would cover their losses if they would leave peacefully.
Nope.
Which, of course, the British government absolutely refused to do. The outcry over this illegal seizure of British goods began to grow. Meanwhile, back in China, a reprehensible incident occurred where some drunken British sailors beat a man to death. Lin Zexu demanded the execution of a British sailor.
Oh, I didn't know that. I wasn't taught about that in school.
In recompense. Captain Elliot, who actually disliked the opium trade and was somewhat sympathetic to the Chinese situation, put out a reward for evidence of who had committed the murder, and gave money to the victim's family. He then had the criminals tried on his ship, inviting Lin Zexu or a representative to witness the proceedings, although none took him up on the invitation. He sentenced the men to hard labor back in England, but this wouldn't work for Lin Zexu. After all, the whole point of his demand was to show that foreigners couldn't just violate Chinese law on Chinese soil. So in response, he stopped all food being supplied to the British and posted signs telling them that frothier water sources had been poisoned. Next, he ordered the Portuguese to eject all British from Macau. He was going to see these pesky British and their drugs off Chinese soil once and for all. So the British retreated to a barren nothing island off the coast. A barren nothing island that will eventually be known as Hong Kong.
Wait, really? That's Hong Kong? Wow, I didn't know.
Their food crisis was at a head, though. Captain Elliot sent a request for food sales to resume. The response was delayed, so he sent men ashore to buy food. But as they were heading back, these provisions were seized by Chinese officials. Soon, a firefight broke out between the blockading Chinese junks and the British ships, and thus began the First Opium War.
Okay. I love extra credits. They do a good job at explaining historical events in a way that is easily understandable. And since I was taught about this in school, I do know at least half or most of it. But some of it, such as Charles Eliot, I did not know, either because I forgot whether or not he was taught in class, or our textbook didn't include his name, so yeah. But anyway, that's all I have to say, really. If you liked this video, please hit that like and subscribe. Check out my Facebook page. Link to the original videos by Extra Credits down below. I highly recommend you check out their channel. They do amazing content. But yeah, that's all for today. I'll see you guys next time. Bye!